3 weeks before everything fell apart, Daniel Harper received a message that would later be read out loud in a courtroom. It was short, just one sentence, a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. The message read, "Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt." At the time, it looked like nothing more than an argument between people who had known each other for years. Friends sometimes say harsh things. People get emotional. Words are thrown around. But that one sentence would eventually become the center of a police investigation, a national news story, and a courtroom filled with grieving families searching for answers. Because the man who received that warning, Daniel Harper, would ignore it completely. And what happened after he ignored it would destroy everything he had built, everything he believed about himself, and every life connected to him. Daniel Harper was the kind of man most people trusted immediately. He was 42 years old, lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, and worked as a regional logistics manager for a construction supply company. Neighbors described him as calm, responsible, and dependable, the type of man who waved when he drove by and helped shovel snow from the sidewalk in winter. He coached youth baseball on weekends and attended church with his younger sister and her 2 sons. By every outward appearance, Daniel had done what millions of Americans spend their lives trying to do. He built stability, a steady career, a respectable reputation, a life that looked ordinary in the best possible way. And yet, 3 weeks after that warning arrived on his phone, police cars would surround his home before sunrise, reporters would gather outside the courthouse, and investigators would begin asking one chilling question. Why didn't Daniel Harper listen? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this unfold slowly, and understanding how they happen requires patience, attention, and sometimes a willingness to see how one decision can quietly lead to another until the outcome can no longer be avoided. Because when people later looked back at the final weeks before everything collapsed, many of them said the same thing. The warning had been clear. The danger had been obvious. And yet Daniel Harper continued forward as if nothing could possibly go wrong. The person who sent that message was a man named Travis Cole. Travis was 39, a mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop about 15 minutes from Daniel's house. The 2 men had known each other since high school. They were not best friends, but their lives had crossed paths repeatedly over the years. Travis repaired Daniel's truck more than once, and they occasionally met for drinks at a neighborhood bar called the Green Lantern, a quiet place where the same customers often sat in the same seats every Friday night. For nearly 2 decades, their relationship had remained simple. Friendly conversations, occasional favors, the kind of connection that exists comfortably without much effort. But during the months leading up to that message, something changed between them. Something that would eventually turn a casual friendship into a confrontation investigators would later analyze minute by minute. The story begins several months earlier, during a particularly difficult winter for Daniel's company. Supply chains had slowed, construction projects were being delayed, and Daniel's department was under pressure to keep deliveries moving. Co-workers later said Daniel had been working longer hours than usual. 12-hour days were becoming normal. Phone calls continued late into the night. Stress followed him home. At first, it seemed like temporary pressure that would eventually pass. But stress has a way of shifting people's behavior in ways that are difficult to recognize until much later. Daniel became impatient with coworkers. He stopped attending baseball practices for the kids he coached. Friends noticed he rarely joined their Friday gatherings anymore. When he did show up, he often left early after staring at his phone for most of the evening. Around the same time, Travis Cole began noticing something else. Several customers from his repair shop started mentioning Daniel's name during casual conversation. At first, the comments sounded harmless. Someone said Daniel had recently helped them find cheaper building materials. Another mentioned that Daniel seemed to know how to get construction supplies delivered quickly even when other companies couldn't. But then the conversations became more specific. One customer joked that Daniel could make a shipment appear out of nowhere if the price was right. Travis laughed at the time, assuming people were exaggerating. But over the next few weeks, he heard similar comments again and again. Each story suggested the same thing. Daniel Harper had started making arrangements that were not entirely part of his official job. Investigators would later discover that during this period, Daniel had quietly begun using his position to redirect small shipments of construction materials. The quantities were not enormous at first. A few pallets of tools, some industrial equipment that had been listed as delayed. The paperwork was adjusted so the deliveries appeared postponed or misplaced. Meanwhile, the materials were sold privately to contractors who were willing to pay cash for immediate supply. In the beginning, Daniel likely convinced himself the situation was temporary, just a way to relieve financial pressure, just a few transactions that no one would notice. But small decisions rarely remain small for long. Once the first step is taken, the next one often feels easier. Travis Cole discovered part of this arrangement when a contractor he knew mentioned buying equipment from Daniel directly. The contractor casually explained that Daniel had offered him a good price because the items were extra inventory. Travis immediately felt uneasy. Something about the explanation didn't sound right. He had known Daniel for years, and although Daniel could be stubborn, he had never been reckless with his career. So Travis called him one evening and asked a simple question. What exactly are you doing with these deliveries people keep talking about? According to phone records examined later by detectives, the conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. It began calmly. Travis asked questions. Daniel responded vaguely. But eventually the tone changed. Daniel insisted he knew what he was doing. Travis warned him the situation could lead to serious consequences. Daniel grew defensive. Over the next several days, the tension between them increased. Travis sent Daniel a series of messages telling him to slow down before someone noticed the missing shipments. Daniel replied only once, writing that everything was under control and that Travis should mind his own business. Then came the final message, the one investigators would later read aloud during trial. Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt. When Daniel saw those words appear on his screen late that night, he dismissed them almost immediately. In his mind, Travis was exaggerating. Nothing bad had happened yet. The transactions were small. The paperwork still looked normal. And besides, Daniel believed he could correct everything later if necessary. Many people make the same calculation when facing a risky decision. They assume the future will offer an opportunity to fix the present. For nearly 2 weeks after receiving that warning, Daniel continued exactly as before. Deliveries were adjusted. Calls were made to contractors. Cash payments arrived quietly. On the surface, his life appeared unchanged. But the network of people involved in the arrangement was expanding. More contractors were hearing about Daniel's ability to move supplies quickly. Requests increased. And with each new request, the scale of the shipments grew slightly larger. What Daniel didn't realize was that one of those contractors had already attracted attention from local authorities during a separate investigation involving stolen equipment. Detectives were monitoring several business transactions connected to that contractor. When Daniel's name appeared during one of those monitored conversations, investigators began asking questions that would eventually lead straight to him. The final week before everything collapsed began quietly. Daniel attended work meetings, answered emails, and drove home through the same suburban streets he had traveled for years. But on a cold Tuesday evening, something happened that investigators would later describe as the moment when events could no longer be reversed. Daniel received a phone call from Travis Cole. The call lasted only 4 minutes. No recording exists, but cell tower data confirmed its timing. According to Travis's later testimony, he had called Daniel one last time hoping to convince him to stop. Travis had recently heard that investigators were asking about missing equipment connected to several contractors. He wanted Daniel to understand the situation was becoming serious. Daniel responded by telling him again to stay out of it. The conversation ended abruptly, and within 72 hours, police officers would be standing outside Daniel Harper's home as flashing lights illuminated the quiet neighborhood where everything had once seemed perfectly normal. On the surface, everything looked normal. The street where Daniel Harper lived was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted quiet. Tree-lined sidewalks, 2-car garages, neighbors who recognized each other's vehicles before they recognized the license plates. On summer evenings, families sat on their front porches while children rode bicycles in slow circles around the block. Daniel had lived there for nearly 7 years, long enough to become part of the rhythm of the neighborhood. People knew him as the dependable guy with the dark pickup truck who left for work early and returned just before sunset. If you had asked anyone on that street to describe Daniel Harper, they likely would have said the same thing. Steady, polite, predictable. The kind of man you wouldn't think twice about. And that's exactly why the story that would later emerge shocked everyone who thought they understood him. Daniel's life, at least from the outside, seemed organized and comfortable. Photographs from his social media pages showed weekend cookouts, baseball games with his nephews, and the occasional fishing trip with coworkers. In one picture, he stands beside a lake holding a small bass, smiling with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes the future is under control. Another photo shows him sitting at a crowded restaurant table, surrounded by friends raising glasses during a birthday celebration. None of those pictures hinted at tension or conflict. None suggested the kind of situation that would one day bring police officers, investigators, and reporters into the same quiet neighborhood. Yet hidden inside the timeline of those ordinary photographs were the early signs of a decision Daniel had already begun making. A decision that would eventually connect his life to a man named Travis Cole in ways neither of them fully understood at the time. Travis Cole lived across town, about 15 minutes from Daniel's neighborhood. His world looked different, but equally stable. Travis owned a modest auto repair shop that had been operating for nearly a decade. The shop sat beside a busy road where commuters stopped for quick repairs or routine maintenance. Customers described Travis as straightforward and honest, the kind of mechanic who explained problems clearly instead of inventing extra work. His reputation had grown slowly but steadily, and many drivers in the area trusted him enough to recommend the shop to friends. Travis and Daniel had known each other since their teenage years. They weren't inseparable, but their lives intersected often enough that the connection never faded. They met occasionally for drinks, talked about sports, complained about work, and laughed about the strange directions adulthood had taken them since high school. Then, one evening, Travis sent the message that would later be repeated again and again during an investigation. It appeared on Daniel's phone without warning. Just a short sentence. A sentence that seemed emotional in the moment, but would later carry enormous weight. Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt. At the time, that message sounded like the end of an argument between two men who had known each other long enough to speak bluntly. But when detectives eventually looked at it months later, they saw something very different. They saw a warning. A warning connected to actions Daniel had already taken and decisions he continued to make long after receiving it. That single sentence would become the starting point for investigators trying to understand the chain of events that led to the night everything changed. Because the truth is that stories like this rarely begin with a single dramatic moment. They begin quietly. Small conversations, minor disagreements, choices that feel temporary at the time. For Daniel Harper, the path toward that final night had already started weeks earlier. The warning from Travis was not the beginning of the problem. It was the moment someone tried to stop it. The real question investigators would later ask was much simpler and far more troubling. If Daniel had been warned so clearly, why did he ignore it? Why did he continue forward as though nothing serious could happen? And how did a single message between two longtime acquaintances become the first piece of evidence in a case that would soon capture the attention of an entire community? Those questions would eventually shape everything that followed. What exactly was the warning about? Why did Daniel Harper dismiss it so easily? And how did that one sentence lead directly to the worst night of his life? Because the truth behind this story would turn out to be far more complicated than anyone expected, and understanding it requires looking carefully at the weeks leading up to the moment when police lights first appeared on that quiet suburban street. Daniel Harper grew up in a place where life followed a simple rhythm. He was raised in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, the kind of community where high school football games filled the stands on Friday nights, and neighbors rarely locked their front doors. His father worked as an electrician, and his mother spent nearly 30 years as a receptionist at a local dental clinic. Nothing about Daniel's childhood stood out as unusual. Teachers described him as quiet but dependable. He wasn't the loudest student in class or the most athletic player on the field, but he was steady. The type of kid who showed up on time, finished his assignments, and rarely caused trouble. Friends from those years later remembered him as someone who liked routine. He enjoyed knowing what tomorrow would look like. That sense of structure followed him into adulthood and helped shape the life he eventually built. After graduating from high school, Daniel attended a regional college where he studied supply chain management, a practical degree that promised stable employment. He wasn't interested in chasing big dreams or unpredictable opportunities. Daniel wanted security. Within a few years of graduating, he found a position at a construction supply company that distributed tools, equipment, and materials to contractors across several Midwestern states. It wasn't a glamorous career, but it offered something Daniel valued deeply: consistency. Over time, he worked his way into a regional logistics role, managing shipments and coordinating deliveries between warehouses and job sites. Coworkers described him as organized and calm under pressure. When problems appeared, Daniel usually solved them quietly without drawing attention to himself. His supervisors trusted him with responsibility because he rarely made mistakes. For more than a decade, his career moved forward in exactly the steady way he had always hoped it would. Outside of work, Daniel lived a life that many people would recognize immediately. His house sat in that quiet Columbus neighborhood where trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes created a sense of order. On weekends, he visited his sister Melissa and her 2 sons, often bringing pizza or taking the boys to baseball practice. Melissa later told investigators that Daniel never seemed interested in starting a family of his own, but he loved being an uncle. Those small moments gave him a sense of belonging that work alone could never provide. Neighbors often saw him mowing his lawn on Saturday mornings or loading fishing gear into the back of his truck before driving toward a nearby lake. If someone had asked Daniel to describe success, he likely would have pointed to exactly what he had already built: a stable job, a quiet home, and a circle of familiar people he trusted. Yet beneath that steady surface, there were small details about Daniel's personality that sometimes created tension. He was disciplined, but he could also be stubborn. When he believed he understood a situation better than others, he rarely changed his mind. Coworkers occasionally noticed that Daniel disliked being questioned. If someone suggested a different way of solving a problem, he sometimes reacted defensively, as though the suggestion implied he had done something wrong. Friends from high school remembered the same trait. Daniel was loyal and dependable, but once he committed to an idea, convincing him otherwise could be nearly impossible. For years, that stubbornness never caused serious problems. In fact, it sometimes helped him stay focused when others became distracted. But personality traits that seem harmless in normal circumstances can become dangerous when pressure begins to build. During the months leading up to the message Travis Cole sent him, several people in Daniel's life began noticing subtle changes. Melissa mentioned that her brother seemed distracted during family dinners. Instead of laughing with the kids, he spent more time checking his phone. A coworker named Richard Bennett later told investigators that Daniel had started volunteering for extra responsibilities at work, especially tasks involving shipment adjustments and delivery scheduling. At first, it looked like ambition. Companies appreciate employees who take initiative. But Richard eventually noticed that Daniel was handling certain shipments personally instead of letting warehouse staff manage them through the usual system. It wasn't necessarily wrong, but it was unusual enough that people started asking quiet questions. Travis Cole noticed the changes too. Their conversations at the bar became shorter and more guarded. When Travis asked how work was going, Daniel answered vaguely and quickly changed the subject. At first, Travis assumed Daniel was simply stressed from long hours at the logistics office. Many people in demanding jobs go through periods where work consumes most of their attention. But over time, Travis began sensing that Daniel was carrying a kind of tension that hadn't been there before. The calm confidence Daniel once displayed was slowly being replaced by something harder to describe. He was still organized, still careful, but there was an edge to his voice when certain topics came up, particularly anything involving shipments, contractors, or business deals outside his company's normal operations. Looking back later, people who knew Daniel struggled to identify the exact moment when everything began shifting. There was no dramatic turning point, no single day when someone could say things suddenly went wrong. Instead, the change appeared gradually, hidden inside everyday routines. Daniel still woke up early for work. He still visited his sister's house on weekends. He still waved to neighbors while pulling into his driveway after sunset. Yet beneath those familiar patterns, new habits were quietly forming. Phone calls that happened late at night. Meetings with contractors that didn't appear on official schedules. Conversations that ended abruptly whenever someone asked too many questions. None of those details seemed alarming on their own, but together they created a pattern that would later become extremely important to investigators. The warning message Travis eventually sent Daniel did not appear out of nowhere. It came after weeks of watching those subtle changes accumulate. Travis had known Daniel long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, even if he couldn't immediately explain what it was. At first, he tried to ignore the feeling, assuming Daniel was simply dealing with stress from work. But the more he heard from customers mentioning Daniel's name in connection with unusual supply deals, the more concerned he became. Each comment sounded small by itself. Yet every time Travis heard Daniel's name linked to these transactions, the same uneasy thought returned. Something about the situation didn't add up. People who knew Daniel closely would later say that around this time, something had definitely started to change. It wasn't obvious enough to cause immediate alarm, but it was there in the way he spoke, the way he guarded certain conversations, and the way he dismissed anyone who questioned what he was doing. Those small shifts in behavior might have seemed harmless in the moment, but they were the earliest signs that the stable life Daniel Harper had spent decades building was beginning to move in a direction he could no longer fully control. And within a matter of weeks, that quiet change would lead directly to the warning Travis Cole felt he had no choice but to send. 3 weeks before the night investigators would later reconstruct minute by minute, Daniel Harper received the message that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It arrived late in the evening, just after 10 o'clock, while Daniel was sitting in the living room of his quiet suburban home. The television was on, but he wasn't really watching it. His phone buzzed on the coffee table beside him. When he picked it up, he saw the name Travis Cole appear on the screen. The two men had spoken earlier that week, but the conversation had ended awkwardly. Daniel assumed Travis was still upset about the questions he had been asking. At first, he considered ignoring the message entirely, but curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. The message was short, direct, and unusually serious for the kind of conversations Travis and Daniel usually had. "Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at the screen. The words were blunt enough that they almost felt exaggerated. Travis had always been straightforward, but this sounded more like a warning than a complaint. Daniel leaned back on the couch, thinking about what Travis could possibly mean by stop. From Daniel's perspective, nothing serious had happened yet. The shipments he had quietly redirected still appeared normal in the company's system. Contractors were receiving materials faster than they expected, and the extra money he was making felt like a temporary advantage rather than a permanent problem. In Daniel's mind, Travis was reacting emotionally without understanding the full situation. What Daniel didn't know at the time was that Travis had spent the previous several days piecing together details he hadn't noticed before. Customers visiting the repair shop had mentioned Daniel's name repeatedly while discussing construction materials that seemed to appear from unusual sources. One contractor even joked that Daniel had connections that could move inventory faster than the official warehouses. At first, Travis laughed at the comment, but the more he heard similar stories, the more uncomfortable he became. Travis had known Daniel since they were teenagers, long enough to recognize when something didn't sound right. And the pattern of conversations he was hearing suggested that Daniel had started making deals that were no longer part of his normal job. Earlier that same evening, Travis had tried calling Daniel before sending the message. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. According to phone records reviewed later by detectives, the conversation ended abruptly. Travis asked directly whether Daniel had been selling equipment privately to contractors. Daniel responded with irritation, insisting that everything he was doing was legitimate and that Travis should stop asking questions about business that didn't involve him. Travis tried to explain that people were talking, that contractors were mentioning Daniel's name openly, and that situations like this rarely stayed quiet for long. But Daniel dismissed the concern almost immediately. He told Travis the rumors were exaggerated and that there was nothing to worry about. After that call ended, Travis sat in his repair shop office for nearly half an hour thinking about what to do next. Part of him considered letting the situation go entirely. Daniel was an adult and capable of making his own decisions. But another part of him kept returning to the same uneasy thought. If Daniel really was redirecting shipments from his company, the consequences could become serious very quickly. Construction supply companies track inventory carefully, and missing equipment eventually raises questions. Travis knew that if investigators ever started looking into the situation, Daniel could face charges that would destroy his career and possibly his freedom. That was the moment Travis decided to send the message that would later become so important. When Daniel finished reading the text, he shook his head and let out a quiet laugh. To him, Travis sounded dramatic. People often overreact when they hear rumors, and Daniel believed Travis simply didn't understand how controlled the situation actually was. The shipments were small compared to the total volume his company handled every week. Adjustments in delivery schedules happened constantly in the logistics business. As long as the paperwork looked correct, no one would notice the difference. Daniel placed the phone back on the table and returned his attention to the television. Within minutes, he had convinced himself the warning didn't deserve serious attention. The following morning, Daniel woke up early and left for work exactly as he did every weekday. The message from Travis stayed on his phone, but it no longer occupied his thoughts. He continued making calls to contractors and coordinating shipments that never appeared on the official company schedule. Each transaction brought in more cash and reinforced the belief that he was managing the situation successfully. When coworkers asked about certain delayed deliveries, Daniel explained the adjustments calmly and confidently. No one challenged his answers. After all, Daniel Harper had spent years proving he could handle complicated logistics problems without creating chaos. But while Daniel moved forward with complete confidence, Travis Cole couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The message he had sent was not meant to start a fight. It was meant to stop one from happening later. Travis understood how quickly situations involving money and missing equipment could attract attention from the wrong people. He hoped Daniel would read the warning, reconsider what he was doing, and quietly step away before anyone else noticed. Yet as the days passed, Travis heard more contractors casually mentioning Daniel's name when discussing supply deals. Instead of slowing down, Daniel seemed to be expanding the arrangement. Investigators would later discover that during the same week Travis sent that warning, Daniel had arranged the largest shipment he had redirected so far. It involved industrial equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars that had been marked in the company's system as temporarily delayed due to transportation issues. In reality, the equipment had been delivered to a contractor who paid Daniel privately. That single decision increased the risk surrounding Daniel's actions dramatically, because unknown to him, one of the contractors involved in the transaction had already been under quiet observation by local authorities investigating stolen construction materials in several nearby counties. None of that information had reached Daniel yet. From his perspective, everything was still under control. The warning Travis sent remained just another message buried in his phone's conversation history. But the sentence Travis wrote carried a meaning Daniel hadn't considered. It wasn't simply a prediction about what might happen in the future. It was connected to a situation that had already begun unfolding beyond Daniel's awareness. Because while Daniel believed the shipments were invisible inside the system, investigators were slowly starting to notice a pattern that would soon lead them directly to his name. And that was the part Daniel Harper never saw coming. The warning Travis Cole sent was not just about protecting Daniel from a mistake he might make later. It was about a chain of events that had already started moving quietly in the background. A chain of events that would soon bring detectives, evidence files, and flashing police lights into the quiet neighborhood where Daniel had once believed nothing serious could ever happen. In the weeks following the message Travis Cole sent that evening, Daniel Harper continued living the same routine he had followed for years. At least on the surface. He still woke up early, drove the same route to the logistics office, and returned home before dark. Neighbors still saw his truck pull into the driveway at roughly the same time every evening. But behind that routine, subtle changes were beginning to appear. Changes that people around Daniel started noticing even if they couldn't immediately explain what felt different. Phone calls became more frequent, especially late at night. Sometimes Daniel stepped outside while speaking, pacing slowly across the driveway with his voice lowered just enough that anyone nearby could tell the conversation wasn't meant for others to hear. At first, these calls didn't seem unusual. After all, Daniel worked in logistics, a field where shipments moved across multiple time zones and delays often required late conversations. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Co-workers at the distribution office noticed something similar. Daniel had always been organized, but now he seemed unusually protective of certain shipments. Instead of letting warehouse staff handle delivery schedules through the company's standard tracking system, he began managing specific orders himself. When colleagues asked why certain deliveries were being rerouted or marked as delayed, Daniel usually had an explanation ready. Sometimes he blamed transportation problems. Other times he said a contractor had requested a schedule adjustment. Most of the explanations sounded reasonable in isolation. Yet the frequency of those changes gradually increased, and some employees began wondering why the same shipments repeatedly passed through Daniel's hands before leaving the warehouse. Around the same time, Daniel's personal finances started reflecting the quiet deals he had been arranging. Bank records later examined by investigators revealed a pattern that seemed small at first but became clearer over several weeks. Deposits began appearing that did not match Daniel's regular salary. They weren't enormous amounts, and they were often spread across different days, which made them easy to overlook. But taken together, those deposits represented thousands of dollars arriving through channels that did not connect to Daniel's official job. Some payments appeared as cash deposits. Others arrived through transfers connected to contractors who had recently purchased materials through Daniel's unofficial arrangements. Each transaction reinforced the belief Daniel had already formed. The system worked, and no one seemed to notice. But while Daniel felt more confident, Travis Cole grew increasingly uneasy. Customers at the repair shop continued mentioning Daniel during casual conversation. One contractor even asked Travis directly whether Daniel could help him locate a large shipment of specialized equipment that had been difficult to obtain through normal suppliers. The request immediately caught Travis's attention. The scale of the equipment being discussed was far larger than the small deliveries he had heard about earlier. That conversation convinced Travis the situation had moved beyond a few quiet favors between contractors. Daniel was becoming known as someone who could move inventory outside official channels. And the more people who learned about it, the more likely it was that someone would eventually start asking serious questions. Travis tried reaching Daniel again several times over the next week. Some calls went unanswered. When Daniel did respond, his tone was noticeably sharper than before. Travis reminded him about the message he had sent earlier and repeated the same warning. If Daniel kept making these deals, someone was eventually going to notice missing shipments. Daniel reacted with irritation. He insisted that the paperwork was under control and that Travis was exaggerating the situation. At one point, Daniel even joked that Travis sounded like a nervous accountant instead of the easygoing mechanic he had always known. The comment ended the conversation quickly, leaving Travis frustrated and unsure how else to convince his old friend to slow down. Meanwhile, other people in Daniel's life were beginning to sense that something wasn't right. His sister Melissa noticed that Daniel had started canceling family dinners more often. When he did visit, he seemed distracted. Instead of joking with his nephews the way he normally did, he often stepped outside to answer phone calls. Melissa later recalled that Daniel had begun carrying 2 phones, something she had never seen him do before. When she asked about it, Daniel casually explained that one device was for work. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Melissa still felt that her brother seemed tense in a way she couldn't remember seeing before. Even Daniel's coworkers began noticing changes in his behavior. Richard Bennett, the colleague who shared several logistics responsibilities with Daniel, later told investigators that Daniel had become unusually secretive about certain shipment records. If someone asked about inventory numbers tied to specific deliveries, Daniel often handled the request personally instead of allowing others to check the database. Richard didn't immediately suspect anything illegal, but the pattern felt strange enough that he mentioned it during a routine conversation with a supervisor. At the time, the supervisor dismissed the concern. Daniel had worked there for years without causing problems, and minor scheduling adjustments happen regularly in the logistics industry. No one realized that those adjustments were slowly creating a trail investigators would soon begin following. As the weeks passed, Daniel's decisions also became riskier. The shipments he redirected grew larger. Contractors who had heard about his connections began requesting materials worth tens of thousands of dollars. Each successful delivery strengthened Daniel's confidence. The warning Travis had sent weeks earlier felt increasingly distant, like a dramatic comment that no longer applied to the reality Daniel believed he was controlling. He convinced himself that if problems ever appeared, he could simply stop the arrangement and correct the paperwork before anyone looked closely. That belief allowed him to keep moving forward without considering how complicated the situation had already become. Behind the scenes, however, the same contractor who had quietly purchased Daniel's largest shipment was attracting attention from law enforcement. Authorities investigating stolen construction equipment had been monitoring several transactions linked to that contractor's business. When financial records began showing unusual purchases of high-value materials delivered through unofficial channels, detectives started tracing where those materials originated. The process moved slowly at first, involving paperwork requests, shipment logs, and conversations with suppliers. But piece by piece, the information began pointing toward a pattern of deliveries connected to one logistics manager whose name appeared repeatedly in adjusted records. Piece by piece, the perfect life Daniel Harper had built was beginning to unravel, even though he couldn't see it happening. Friends were noticing his strange behavior. Travis Cole was growing more alarmed with every passing week. Coworkers were quietly questioning the shipment changes appearing in the system. And investigators, working from a completely different angle, were slowly collecting information that would eventually lead them directly to Daniel's door. Yet Daniel continued forward with the same confidence he had always trusted, convinced that the system around him was too large and too complicated for anyone to notice what he was doing. Subscribe, stay alert. What happens next? Watch out.